Hello and welcome to this JSON Web Token Authentication tutorial using Django and Vue. This tutorial is part 2. In the first tutorial, we configured a Django API application and connected a Vue application to access the data from the Django API. In this tutorial, we work towards adding authentication to our Django API first by configuring the Django backend, and then we set up the Vue application. So this is the workflow for Vue application that we're going to develop. So continuing from the first tutorial, we just now need to extend the application to include logout, login, and store. So we need to reconfigure the router and then build some login functionality. We then create or develop a token storage area and then build the post view so that we can access and display data from the API. So once we get to step 5, you'll have a working example of JWT being utilized to authenticate Vue to access the data from the Django API. So we move on and add some authentication to pages. So I'll give you an example of how to do that with redirect, and then we'll build a logout functionality, and then I'll give you an example of displaying links if you're only logged in. So we'll then finalize that with including an add idle feature so that after a couple of seconds or however long you want, the user will be logged out. So this is not intended to be a complete guide, but rather an overview of the basics to get you up and running so that you can get to know Vue and understand what the framework has to offer. So as we're working from the previous tutorial, we're going to need the code from the previous tutorial. So let's just head over to GitHub and download that. I'll leave the link in the description. Of course, you can download this via the command prompt via Git. So I'm just going to download this if you're not familiar using the command prompt and GitHub and Git, etc. So that's downloaded. I'll just show that. Just going to copy that across to my desktop and extract it right here. Okay, so let's close all this. Don't need that. So this is the application from the first tutorial. So we can utilize this folder. So the first thing we need to do now is just get Django started. We'll work through the Django steps, configuring JWT, and then we'll move on to the Vue application. So to get Django started, just head into the folder and copy this link, or just open up the command prompt at this directory. So open up the command prompt, type in cd, paste that in. So now I'm in that directory. So in this directory, I need to add a virtual environment. So -m. So I'll just build a new virtual environment in this folder. Once I've done that, I will then just activate this virtual environment. So we just need to go into the scripts folder and then activate. So now that's activated. It's not very handy. This is quite a long directory path. So now that's activated, we can now think about installing the dependencies that are required to get this application working. So we can just remove this path by typing in prompt $G. And you can see now that we've just got the prompt. We don't actually have the whole path, so you'll be able to see the commands more easily. So now we can go ahead and install the requirements. So if you don't know what this means, if you go into the folder here, you'll see that there's a requirements file. So these are all the dependencies that are required in order to get this Django working in the first place. So in the previous tutorial, we installed the Django REST framework and the CORS headers. So we're going to need that to get this application working again. So in order to run and install that, we can just type in pip and then install -r and then requirements index.txt. So that's just going to go through that text file and install all the applications to make sure that it matches the previous environment we set up in tutorial 1. So now that's installed, we should be able to run the manage.py run. So we'll just do a migrate. There's nothing to migrate, so we'll then run the manage.py again, and this time run the server. So you can see that the server is running, so we can just double check that, open it up in the browser, and then the username, if I just log out, the username for this is just admin, and then the password is also admin. If you've downloaded the repo from GitHub, that's going to be the case, and you can see here we've got some posts ready to be accessed via the API. Okay, so that's working okay. So now we can move to the first stage of setting up Django with JWT. So in this example, we're using the simple JWT authentication plugin. So we need to first install this. So if you go over to the documentation, this will take you through some of the basic requirements and settings that you'll need to configure. So we'll be following this. So let's first of all get started by installing it. So I'm just going to stop the server, clear that. So we need to install the Django REST framework simple JWT. So pip install. So now that's installed, let's head over to our Visual Studio Code and open up the folder. So I'll just copy that and then open the folder. Okay, so much of the configuration for Django is going to be applied in the main app in the settings file. So there isn't too much to it to set up with simple JWT. We need to ensure we've got the core headers from the previous tutorial. So here we add into the installed apps the REST framework simple JWT token blacklist, so that in the database we can blacklist some tokens if we want to. And then just make sure you've got the core origin whitelist so that we can define who can access our API or what domain or what IP address, etc. And we got the cores allow headers. And then at the bottom for simple JWT, we add the REST framework simple JWT authentication. So that's going to be the default authentication for this API. So now heading over to the URLs of our API app. So the simple JWT comes with pre-made views. So we just need to hook into those. So we're going to need two here, one being the token obtain pair and then the token refresh view. So these are URLs or paths that we're going to need to access from our Vue application to obtain a token and then refresh a token. So in this tutorial, I don't go as far as refreshing tokens, but we'll definitely be accessing tokens from our Django API. So that's that in place. So now we have that in place. Now let's just run the database. We're going to make migration. So now we have that in place. Now let's just make our database. So I've deleted a database. I'm going to recreate the database. So I'm going to run a make migrations and then migrate. So now we have that in place. Let's now just go over to the command prompt and run a make migrations. So I have deleted the old database. So I'm going to start from new and So now I'm going to run a migrate. So notice that when we migrate, it also sets up the JWT tables. So now I'm just going to create a super user again. Yep, and so I created a new super user. So let's just now run the server. And just test to see if that's working. So we should have some new tables from our simple JWT. So we'll just go to the admin and log in. So you can see here we've got the blacklisted tokens and outstanding tokens. There's nothing inside of that at the moment. So when someone logs in or utilizes a login from our Vue app, a token is going to be created, and that's going to then be utilized to authenticate that user and then for them to allow access to our API and our data. So there's nothing in post, so I'll just add a few more items to post. So just to confirm, I deleted the old database by just going into the folder and deleting the SQLite database, and I've just recreated it. And now I've just added some more data to the database. So we should be able to see something now when we set up our Vue application. Of course, you can change and make whatever you like here. And maybe you want to use a different table, for example. So that data is in place. So that's all that we have here in our database. So that's ready to start. So let's just test, first of all, that our API is working without authentication. And then we're actually going to apply the authentication within the Django application. So I'm just going to open up Postman. You could use curl, for example, but we're just going to be utilizing Postman here. So let's just see if that works. So it's collecting the data from our API. That's what we just typed into our database. Okay, so now for the actual applying authentication, so that someone actually needs to authenticate to access this data. To now apply the security authentication to our data, if we head over to the views of the API app, first of all, we need to import the REST framework permissions. So is authenticated, and then we will apply that to our class here. So permission class is authenticated. So now what we're saying is that in order to access this API data, you have to be authenticated. And we know that the default authentication method is going to be using our simple JWT. So let's head over now to Postman and just send this again. And you can see now we have a message, authentication credentials were not provided. So authentication has now been activated on our API, and now we have to actually authenticate with a token. So let's just test to make sure that we can get a new token from our Django application, our Django API. So we'll head over into a new tab and we're going to create a post. So we need the URL. :8000, so that's our server address. And if we go back into the code, you can see here to get a new token is the API token. So API token. So that's the address for that. So now we need to add a few parameters. So my user is admin and admin, the username and password. So first of all, let's go over to the body and we need to go into the raw. And we just need to add some JSON here. So username is going to be admin, and then the password, is going to be admin. So this is what we're going to pass into across to our Django API, the username and password. In addition to that, we need to also define inside of our headers, we need the content type to be JSON. If you just head down, there should be, or up here, JSON. Okay, so now we've got that in place. So what we should be able to do now is send a post across to this URL, to our Django API, and we should return our tokens. So let's just give this a go. We'll send that. Okay, sorry, I think I made a mistake here. I don't need a comma there. Okay, so now we have that in place. You can now see it's returned the refresh and the access tokens. So what we can do now is set up another check or another test utilizing these keys to access the data. So to test this, let's open up, well, let's actually just copy this access key. We're going to need this key. So now we've got our key. So let's go over to a new tab. Now, if you remember, the data is at /post. That's the URL for the post data. So before we added authenticated, we were able to access the data from our Django API, and then we added authentication. So now we just need to authenticate. So we can just select authentication and then use the bearer token and just paste our token into there and press send. And that should then return the data from the database. So as far as we're concerned now, we've run a few tests now on our Django API and everything is working. So now we can head over to Vue and set up the Vue app. So back in the repository that we downloaded earlier, we're now heading out of the Django backend into the Vue front end. So I just need to open that up with a command prompt. We just need to build the project to begin with. So we just run an npm install. Okay, so that's installed everything that we need. So let's just run a prompt again. So that just gives us a bit of space. So now we've got that in place. Let's just run npm run serve just to run the development server, see if that works. Yep, so we're working on localhost 8080, so let's just test to make sure that's working. Okay, so this is our application. So it looks like it's working okay. So now we can go ahead and start building. So now that we've determined that the Vue project is working, we can now progress to creating the authentication and connecting to the Django API. So you'll notice that this application no longer outputs the information as it did do before the authentication. Now it should work if we were to go back in to our Django backend into the API app and then our views. So if we were just to open that up, and then just remove permission classes is authenticated. If we refresh the page, that should return the post from the database. So you can clearly see here that how authentication is switched on and off as needed. And of course, this could be utilized in other classes and other views that you create. So now we're ready to work on our Vue application. So just a quick recap, we're going to first create a new resource. Some new resources, login, logout, and store. So those are the three new files that we're going to need to create. So let's just build those first. So first of all, I put the login and logout inside of the views folder. And then I build the store.js file inside of the main application, the main root folder, the src folder. So next up, we need to configure the router. Now the router has already been configured for the post page. So now we need to configure it for the login and logout page. Okay, so this is going to be really simple because we can just copy this twice and move that back. And now we just need to rename these. So one's obviously going to be called login without capitals. And then we need logout. So we've done that. So just make sure you've updated the path, logout, and login. And then in addition to that, up the top here, we need to just import them in. So we do that just by copying that and then just renaming these. Okay, so this is the final routes page. Here we have the import for the post, login, and logout, the files that we just created, and then obviously we've added some more entries here in the routes for logout and login. So now that's done, we can now add or build the login functionality. So that's the next step. So I've gone ahead and created the code for the form. So here you can see that we're utilizing Bootstrap to build a simple framework with a form so that it appears in the center of the page. Now, 2 points to make here is that we've created a paragraph element here with incorrect username or password, and we want that to show when the user types in the wrong username and password. So to get that working, we can use a vif, and that's set to the value incorrect auth. So we'll set up the values in a second. So basically what happens when the page or when the viewer enters this screen, the incorrect auth will be set to false. So this text will not appear. Now, if someone types in the wrong username and password, then the incorrect auth then is switched to true. So therefore this text will appear. So secondly, something else that's important on this form is that we've utilized vevn submit prevent. So basically this prevents the page from refreshing so that we can actually send this data where it needs to go. And then we are going to send this data to the login function in order to generate the login. Okay, so now for the functionality of this page. So what we're going to need here is some data. So we're going to return the username and password. And then we need incorrect auth to be set to false so that when we view this view, that the text will be not shown. So that's now in place. And now what we need to do is configure some methods. So because we need to be able to actually submit this form. So we submit it to login, if you remember here, login. And what we do now is that we request or we dispatch this information over to a new function in the store file that we haven't created yet. And we're going to create a new function inside there called user login. That's going to process all the details. So we're going to pass over to that function the username and password details. So just to reiterate here again, so what we've done is that we've sent the username and password that the user has entered in this view over to the store.js page that we haven't created yet and to the function called user login. And we're sending the data username and password. So obviously what you can see now is that someone's typed in the username and password inside the form. We've then connected this form to the login function here, or the login method here. And now we're sending this data across to the store.js file, to the function inside of there. And the data that we sent is the username and password. So we finish this off by creating a then. So if we are successful in logging in, then we're going to be pushed across to the post link utilizing the router push. So we use named routes here. So it's going to send across to post. So if we go back into the routes, if you remember, we're using name routes. So the name here is called post. So that's going to send us to /. Okay, so that's in place, and then we can catch any errors. Notice that when we catch an error, this incorrect auth is set to true. So when it's set to true, then this will then appear. This text will then appear. There is some additional styling here I placed, but you can style it however you wish. So if you're not too familiar with development and JavaScript and Vue, it's best to try and get a picture in your head of what is happening or the flow of the data here. So what we've done in the previous section in the building the login functionality is we've created a form so users can type in data. We've then managed that data by capturing that data, and we've sent it to the store page or the store file to then be processed. So what we need to do now is with that data is we now need to send that data to our REST or our Django REST API, and then to authenticate that username and password and then return a token. So then once we've got that token, we then store it in our local storage so that we can then use that token and then head over to step 5 and then actually build the post view so that we can access data from our Django API. Okay, so next up we need to create or develop the Vuex store to hold the token. So I have changed this slightly. I did say storage. So the Vuex facility probably isn't best described as storage. So if you're not too familiar with Vuex, we're going to be utilizing it now. I'm going to give you a demonstration of how to initially utilize some of the different features in Vuex and some of the principles. So if you are familiar, if you're not familiar with this, it'd be worth reading or going through this video here on the Vue website, which explains a little bit more about Vuex. So what we plan is we're going to create a Vuex store to hold the token, and then that's now going to be available within our project. And then I'm going to show you how to update the information within the store. So let's start building our store. So we start off with importing Vue and Vuex. We still need to actually install Vuex, so npm install Vuex, we'll do that shortly. So we set up a new Vuex store. So we start like that, and then we move on to state. So state, think of state, we can use it as we use data in the regular Vue instance. However, here the state, we can't directly update the data properties in the state. So inside of our state, we need to have two data properties, access token and refresh token. So here, remember, we're going to access the Django API and request our access token and refresh token. That's then going to be placed here. So in order to get the access token and refresh token in the state or defined in the state, we need to use a mutation. So what we're going to do when we log in is we're going to call this function called update storage, and we're going to pass into it the data we've retrieved from the Django API, so the access and the refresh token. And then we're going to update the state with the access token and refresh token. So let's remember that we've already built a login. So if you remember, in our login, we requested from the store the user login, or we'd sent the data from here to the user login function. So what we need to do now is go back into our store, and we now need to collect that information. So we create an action, and then the function user login, which obviously matches this here. So we then are going to pass in the user credentials, which will be the username and the password. So we pass that into this function here, and then we create a new promise. So here we're going to build a connection to our API. So we want to use get API, and we're going to post this information, remember, to the API token like we did with the Postman app. And then what we want to post is the username and password. So if you remember when we did that with Postman, we posted the username and password, and then it returned the user's refresh and access token. So assuming that is successful, let's now build then. So we now have a response. So what we're going to do now, if we receive a response, we're going to utilize the update store function, and we're going to pass into it the access, which is going to be the response data access. That would be the access token. and then we update the refresh with the response data refresh token. So we pass the access and refresh token into this function here, and then obviously update the state. So a little bit out of sync, we will need to actually install Vuex. So like I previously said, so let's just terminate that and do an npm install Vuex. So just make sure that's installed. So in addition to installing Vuex, if you remember, we're utilizing here Git API. So we're trying to utilize the information here in the Axios API to set up the base and the timeout. So in order to access that, we access that through Get API. So in the store, I've added an import and I've collected that information so that we can actually run the API post. So now we have that in place. Theoretically, we can now access our Django API and collect the tokens. So what we need to do now is build the post. So number 5, build the post view so that we can access and display the data from the API. We should be able to do this now because we've just collected tokens from the Django API. So we can now utilize that information to make the request for the data from our Django API and view the post details on the page. So before we move on to posts, let's just go back into main.js. We've just added 2 new sections here. We've imported the store from /store, and now we've just made it available within our new Vue instance. So that's going to make it easy to access the store from, for example, our views. So now let's build the posts.view. So this is the last stage of actually retrieving the data from our Django API and displaying it on the page. So far we've collected our token from the Django API server, and now we're going to actually try and collect the post data that's stored in the Django API database. So at the moment we've got the navbar in place, and we've imported the navbar, we've given it a name. So next of all, we now need to import a few more things. So first of all, to actually build our API connection, we need to utilize the Axios API JS file. So we import that in, and then we also need the data, or we need the data from our Vuex state. So we import in map state from Vuex. So that's just going to make it easier for us to handle a convenient way of utilizing our properties in our state. So once you've got that in place, we need to obviously include the navbar component, and then we need to actually have a way of storing or utilizing the data that's returned from the Django API. So we're going to eventually map that into our state utilizing API data. So if we go back to store, I've included API data now property in the state so that we can hold the data that's returned from our Django API. So what's happening here is that basically we're going to collect that data so that we can then loop it out on our view. Okay. So now that's in place. Now let's actually create the connection so we can collect the data from our Django API. So the URL is made up from the axios.api. So let's remember, so the base URL, and then we extend that by posts. So that's the URL that we need to use to collect the data from our Django API. And like we did with the Postman, we utilize the bearer, and inside of that we utilize the access token that we're going to collect from the $store, the state, and then the access token. So that's how we're going to access the access token that's currently being held within our store. So using $store here, how that is being utilized, if you remember the previous step in main, we added the store, we imported the store and included it in our Vue instance. And this is how we're actually being able to access our store. Okay, so that information is passed in, and hopefully then that is successful and it returns the data. So we then get a response. So what we do then is we again get the store and then state, we update the state with the API data. So the response.data. So now that's being held in our store and is available now here. So we can now utilize this to loop out on our page. Obviously, we want to catch any errors if there's any problems. So that's an overview of the functionality that's now been provided within this post.vue page. Okay, so now we have the actual container. So this is a Bootstrap container, a new row, and inside of here we have a v-4 equals posts in API data. So we're just having a loop, and we're just going to loop out the post contents and the post title. So the data that's returned from the database, if you remember, the database has two fields. It has title and contents. So we're just looping that out with inside of this card, and that should now be displayed on the screen. So let's go ahead now and run our project. Okay, so at the moment we have to do this manually. So if you remember, we created a login root, so /login. So this is our login. So my username and password is admin. So now this, when we log in, if you remember, should now pass us back to the home page or the post page, but the root directory. And there we go. So it's now collected the data from our Django API. It's been authorized and is now showing the data on the page. So one of the problems you will have with a Vuex store is that, for example, if you refresh the page, then what happens is everything is reset. And notice you cannot now see the data from the Django API. So what you need to do now is obviously go back in and log in, and then log in to see the data again. So this is where local storage comes into play. So if you go back into your code, what you need to do is, when you actually collect the data from your Django API, not only do you want to update your state, but also what you want to do is utilize local storage and hold the information there, so that when you refresh the page, the state can then be populated again by what's held in the local storage. So this was just intended to be an example of Vuex. You can definitely go ahead and apply that to your project. So next up, we're going to add authentication or authorization, to pages. So you actually have to be authorized or be logged in to actually view a page. Otherwise, you'll be redirected to the login page. To add this functionality, we start off in the store.js file. So here we're basically going to be utilizing getters. So getters are part of the Vuex store, and they are used to calculate data based upon the store state. So here we're saying, creating a function logged in, and then we're utilizing the state. So here we're going to return state.accessToken not equal null. Now, obviously, it starts off as null. So if there is a token inside of here, or there is data token here, then it means that the user's logged in. If it represents null, it means that the user isn't logged in. So here we're creating a simple true or false return. So we then head into the main.js, and now we need to set this up. So here what we do first of all is we access the root or the root information or the router information. So record.meta requires login. So what we're going to do now is look through the router records and look for a root that has metadata. So here inside the root, in the posts, in the slash in the root directory, I add some meta and I name it requires login true. So first of all, in the main, we capture which routes has this information, and then we run a simple test. So basically, we just utilize the function that we created, and we just check to see if the user is logged in or not. So if they're not logged in, if there isn't a if there isn't a access token that's been created, then they're going to be sent across to the login route, which is obviously /login. If they are logged in, well, they're just going to proceed over to the post page or the page that they want to access. So if there isn't a record, then we're just going to proceed. So the user can just go to that page. So let's now see that in action. So now we've applied this. So we shouldn't now be able to access the post page directly. And there we go. So we're forwarded directly to our login page. So I'll try logging in again and that will take you back to the root or the post page. And now we can access it because we are indeed logged in. Okay, so that brings us on to an example of adding a logout page or logout functionality. So let's go ahead and now build the logout functionality. So if you head into the logout view, you can see here that we're not actually going to view this page on screen. We're simply going to be passed to the logout.view page here, or this code, this section, this instance, this component, and we're then going to direct this over to the store.js page, where we're going to run a function called user logout. So we do that, and then once that's done, we then push the user to the login page again. So the functionality, so if we head over to the store, so we're going to reuse the getter logged in to check to see if the user is logged in. Remember that if a user is logged in, then they will have an access token here stated in the state. If they're not logged in, then it will equal null. So if we head down into the actions, so here we're going to set up user logout, and we're going to utilize context. So context.getTers logged in. So here basically we're going to check getters to see if the user is logged in. So if this returns true or false, depending if this turns true or false, depends on what happens here. So obviously if the user is logged in, then obviously we want to log out the user. So here we run context commit. So here we're going to destroy the token. So we utilize context.commit to actually commit the mutation, destroy token. So all we do here is we return the access token to null and the refresh token to null in the state. So that's how we're actually going to log out the user. Just remove the access token and the refresh token that might be placed in the state, and we're going to return it to null, the value to null. So let's just see that in action. So we're going to log in, and then at the moment we don't have the actual link, so we'll just type it in menu, log out, and that will then just take us to the login page. So the last example is the idle feature. So imagine someone's logged in for a certain amount of time, you want to log them out. Of course, this idle feature could be utilized for many different features within your application. This is just an example. So we're going to be utilizing this idle Vue npm, this plugin. So let's first install it. So go ahead and stop the server and install this plugin. So this is relatively simple to utilize. So after a quick read, this does provide you the usage instructions. So what we need to do at the root of our project, we need to import the idle Vue plugin, and then we need to add it to the Vue global. Okay, so you can see here that there's other different examples. So we're just going to follow this example here and add it to our application. So we're going to import it. This is in the main.js file. And then we've got a variable here, events hub equals new view. And then we run the view.use and then the idle view, and we've added 2 parameters here, event emitter, event hub, and the idle 10,000. So this is 10 seconds. So what we've done now is we've set up the idle view to run the event after, in this case, 10 seconds. So now we've actually got that idle time in place. We can now actually put it onto the views that we want to use it on. So let's now head over to the post page and add it onto that so that when someone's on that page, after 10 seconds, it logs them out. Okay, so we head over to the post page, and this is really simple. We've added a couple of lines of code here. So we're using onIdle, and what we're doing here is that when the idle timer has finished, we're utilizing this.store dispatch and then user logout. I don't think I've written that right, so it's not user logout. Let's go back to main. We want to run, so the store, which is user logout, so without the underscore there. So we're going to run that function and log out the user. Once they've logged out, they're going to then be pushed over to the login page. So that's going to happen after 10 seconds. So let's just try that out now. I'll just change it to 5 seconds for now. Okay, so let's make sure that the server's on. And then we can test. Okay, so let's head over to the login page. Admin logged in. So wait 5 seconds and hopefully we'll then be logged out. There we go. So that's an example of idle. Okay, so I seem to have jumped ahead then. I forgot number 8, an example of displaying links if only logged in. So let's just head over to the nav bar. So here in the nav bar, what I've done is I've imported the map state from Vuex, and then again I've used computed, and then I've got the map state access token. So here I've directly accessed the access token. So if there isn't an access token here, then we're not going to be able to display a link. If we are logged in, there will be a token, so therefore we display a link. So here what we've done now is used a venv access token, not null. So if there is an access token, we're going to then view this link here, this logout link. If there isn't a access token, it will obviously the value of it will be null, in which case it won't show this link. So that was just a simple example of how to show a link based upon whether someone is logged in or not. Okay, so I think I've covered everything here that I detailed in this coverage, in this workflow for the Vue app. So now we have a working example of Django backend utilizing JWT API authentication. We also now have the Vue app, which can then collect a token and then utilize it to log in a user and access the API data from the Django API. So hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. Again, this wasn't intended to be a complete guide, but an overview of some of the basics. So hopefully you've got a grasp of some of the basics here in terms of setting up a Django API, setting up Vuex, particularly in this tutorial, and then how to manage that, the properties and values within the store. And then just going through some of the basic functionality you might want to include in an app like this. So building the logout, authenticating pages, example of displaying links if only logged in, and then just add a kind of an added bonus, I guess, just adding the idle feature.